Here's Jordan Peterson, and understand what he's trying to argue here. It's very illustrative. If you are one of the people who are, somewhat repelled, and I think in certain instances, I don't think it's as big of a deal, like Jamal Bowie had said to us, get a little bit repelled by the idea of like racism as aesthetics and, what you call sort of like, people malign wokeism as being like, too about like, I don't know, just
victims and stuff like
victims, but also like the proper thing to say and this and that. Understand, Jordan Peterson saying basically the same thing. He is talking that there is no phenomena of racism. There are just people who are mean based upon race. And here he is explaining this concept. And, people who actually know what they're talking about with this stuff are just sort of aghast.
Well, that's a fair point. I'll come to John.
I think the same point I made earlier applies, is that...
Oh, pause it for 1 second. Pause it for 1 second. Pause it for 1 second. They're responding. Apparently, there was a British cricketer. Is it British? A guy named Azeem Rafiq. And apparently he experienced racism from his teammates. And...
Who better ask than Jordan Peterson about that?
Right, exactly. BBC panel.
Well, that's a fair point. I'll come to John.
I think the same point I made earlier applies, is that things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own count.
Now pause it for 1 second. Okay, like understand what he's saying here. Things need to be particularized as opposed to generalized. In other words, I am going to start with the premise that there are no societal phenomenons, that there is no structure to society whatsoever. And you will see, if I start with that assumption, that basic premise, that there are no structures, that there are no broad trends within society, that there is nothing undergirding our existence in society, that moment to moment are completely distinct, that individual to individual are completely distinct. There is no shared experience. There are no shared institutions. If I start with that premise, which is what he says, then guess what? I'm going to find no structural racism. You start with that premise, guess what? You're going to find no structural anything. But that is understand. And it is not a coincidence that this guy is a psychologist, as opposed to a sociologist or an anthropologist or anybody else who comes from the perspective of like, we actually are social beings. We create structures and institutions. There is such a thing as society, and that one society is not the same as another society. And the things that differentiate them is not the individual attributes of each individual in there, but rather the way they are structured.
Yeah, this is why he fetishizes the individual.
All right, play from the beginning, Bradley.
Well, that's a fair point. I'll come to John.
I think the same point I made earlier applies, is that things need to be particularized rather than generalized, as a general rule, let's say. And so this cricket player was facing racism by his own count. The question is, who, when, what, exactly? Because otherwise it degenerates into something like a discussion of structural racism. And when it becomes abstracted up to that level, first of all, that pits group against group, which I think is entirely counterproductive. And it actually doesn't address the issue. Racism is a global and vague term.
Sorry, but
why
would you possibly do that? What did that mean?
Because I said it was a global and vague term.
The inverted commas as if it's not a real thing.
No, that isn't what it meant.
Well, what did it mean then? Explain.
It meant that it's indicative of low-resolution thinking. And what I mean by that is, we use all these terms frequently in discussions like this that are
He was repeatedly
containers
called
of,
abusive terms.
of undifferentiated
He was
content.
repeatedly called abusive terms directly linked to his ethnicity.
By who?
By not just one, but repeated members of the Yorkshire Cricket Club. He's
Okay,
had people
well,
contact him.
then
If it walks like a duck, Jordan,
Then
talks like a duck,
I'm not
it's a duck. It's racism.
I'm not denying his experience.
Right.
What I asked was exactly who and when, and you just answered that
Yes.
question. So I would say those specific people should be held specifically to account for their actions before any movement up the abstraction hierarchy to a discussion of something like structural racism, which I don't think is helpful.
Well, he has talked about institutional racism in cricket. He says that's what he's experienced as a term, institutional racism.
Right, I know. And like I said, I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem, the concept of structural racism. It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that doesn't mean, that does not
Pause
mean
it for 1 second. I just got to jump in here. Understand what he's saying here is that in his calculus, it is a total coincidence that these different individuals attacked this one guy for his ethnicity or his race. It's a total coincidence that they all happen to, because has nothing to do with that one group of people who, that there's probably, according to Jordan Peterson, there could be nothing similar amongst the people who are attacking this one guy. It's just a coincidence that they did it. That's why you need to look at each specific incident as if it is particular, and there is nothing that is consistent there. And the reason why he does it is because he simply wants to deny structural racism. All the gobbledygook he lays in there is just, it's stunning to watch.
Yeah, when he says, I'm not denying his individual experience, he's actually telling the truth there. What he's denying is structural racism entirely. And he's
just saying it's a coincidence.
Yeah, and this is entirely in line with basically with this entire CRT freakout. I'm just going to read this from North Dakota's new ban of critical race theory. It says, for the purposes of this section, critical race theory means a theory that racism is not merely the product of individual bias or prejudice, but that racism is systematically embedded in American society and American legal system to facilitate racial inequality. This is the entire game.
And to think, like, do you think that Jordan Peterson doesn't refer to things like crime? Like, according to Jordan Peterson's theory here, there's no increase in crime. There are just individuals who commit crimes, and it's a coincidence that there may be more crime.
And here's another one. There's no increase in feminists going crazy. There's just individual feminists that you might be able to particularize.
Exactly. I mean, it is low resolution thinking. It is fascinating, the language this guy uses for basically, I'm going to deny that structural racism, that anything structural can exist, and therefore there is no structural racism. It really is just, I mean, embarrassing that this guy is actually sitting on a panel of people who are taking anything seriously. Continue with this, if there's anything left.
I believe that abstracting up the problem to that level of analysis does no good because it pits groups against groups. I think it exacerbates the problem.
Racism is not a function of groups.
It's too imprecise. It doesn't address the issue. Now, that does not mean racism does not exist. That is not what I'm saying in the least.
Maybe let's do less of the hand movements and let's look at the evidence.
So, yeah.
I did it once. But the racism doesn't exist on his, but actually that is what he's saying.
Yeah.
Because it's either individuals who don't like a guy and it's because they don't like his race. But how could two people not like his race in the same way if there is no racism? And then suddenly it's an abstraction. Suddenly it's something that exists and that people tap into, as opposed to be just sort of like generating organically within a person. I mean, according to Jordan Peterson, racists are born. They are not created.
Well, it's like we have terms, it's called bigotry is what he's describing.
bigotry, and there's no, what is the specific bigotry? Maybe he doesn't like him because he doesn't like the way that he, hits the wicket or whatever it is.
Or the facial hair or something.
Yes.
Like that.
I mean, what a clown show this guy is. It really is amazing. You can't come up with a better way of arguing against structural racism, except for the idea of like, we shouldn't even talk about the concept of structures within society, about anything.
Who do you think Peterson's worried about pissing off if he? I think him and when Dave Rubin says like they're gonna go woke to the C-suite. I think these guys are used to talking to like powerful, rich dudes who like that. That's who they're speaking for in this sort of stuff. So it's like we like the Sun's owner has this racism stuff going on right now, and it's like that's who Peterson is serving when he says let's not escalate this up the hierarchy.
Right.
Let's try to keep this as a low level a problem for like HR to deal with.
Right, exactly. This is an individual problem. There is no societal response to this because the problem's not societal. I would be curious to see if he says that about other things. Like, I mean, how does he even talk about the abstraction of masculinity being under attack? How can masculinity exist?
Yeah, he's generalizing too much about the attack on.
It's completely low resolution thinking. You can't see each individual penis because of the low resolution.
I mean, I like low resolution thinking as like the sort of people who were freaking out that Muslims were going to take over Europe 20 years ago.
20 years ago? What was it like? They were talking about no-go neighborhoods like 6-7 years ago? What happened to that phenomena?
Turned out that was low resolution thinking.